on for today's program now on metrics and impacts for library publishing. We have today with us Tomasz, who has administered the York Digital Journals Publishing Program since 2019. The York Digital Journal hosts content for 60 journals, which can be active or discontinued, which can be from faculty or the student-led, and most of them are open access. Tomasz previously worked as the Data, GIS, and Government Documents Librarian at Laurentian University. We also have with us Katie, who worked with open publishing since January 2023 and has been with the university as a public service librarian since 2016. So the University of Alberta. The University of Alberta Library is currently working with 74 actively publishing journals. We will have time for questions at the end, so feel free to take a note for yourself. If ever you think you'll forget the question, you can always put them in the chat. Make sure to make it clear that it's a question for the presenters, and I will get to that at the end, or you can ask them yourself at the end. Ça peut être, comme Caroline a dit, en français ou en anglais. During the presentation, don't hesitate as well if you have extra resources, if there's just a comment. So usually the chat is pretty alive and it's quite interesting, even though sometimes it's a bit confusing, a lot of stuff going on. But the idea, yes, it's to know what Toma and Katie are doing, but it's also to share between ourselves. So all up to you, Toma and Katie, sorry.
Merci beaucoup, Christine. Hello, everyone. My name is Tomasz Mrozewski. I'm going to start things off. Just give me 1 second to get my screen shared. And here we go. Can I get a thumbs up that you can see my screen? Perfect. Thank you, everyone.
All good.
Okay. So my name is Tomasz Mrozewski. As Christine said, I am the Digital Publishing Librarian at York University. I will be presenting in English, mais j'invite les questions, les commentaires et les courriels en français si vous voulez discuter n'importe quoi en français after the session. I want to introduce myself beyond what Christina has said by saying that I'm not an expert or even necessarily a professional in bibliometrics and research impact by any means, but I've come to this by way of my work with library publishing, running the YDJ program at York University Libraries. And questions about research impact and metrics have come up in a few different circumstances that I'll discuss momentarily. But in the course of working with this collection and in trying to answer these metrics questions, some idiosyncrasies and what I think must be particular challenges about the nature of library publishing collections have arisen. So I'm going to speak, I'm going to give a little bit of context about library publishing in Canada. I'm going to introduce some sort of overarching questions that both Katie and I have come up with as we've been preparing for this presentation. And then I'm going to launch into sort of a case study of what it is that we're doing at York and some of the things that we would like to be doing at York, as well as, raising some questions for you, then turning it over to Katie. One thing I should also say is that I do like that in these community calls, they're framed as being able to present about our own work and expertise, as well as being able to ask questions to the community. And it's really in the spirit of that last one of asking questions and advice to the community that I'm approaching this talk here. So let's move forward with this. Sorry, there's the mouse. So again, I've given you a little bit of an introduction about our agenda here. So let's just move on straight on to the key issues. So Katie and I have agreed that this is sort of our key question that we would love your input in. Katie is going to reformulate this at the end of her talk. So as library publishers, we each have lots of data sources and metrics available, multiple stakeholders with different concerns, but limited time and resources for extracting and processing the data, questions about the quality and comprehensiveness of the data sources, and then questions about the appropriateness of these metrics. So the overarching question coming from this state of affairs is, how ought we best focus our efforts to meaningfully showcase the impact of our publishing programs? So I'm not going to read directly from the slides for the whole thing, but I want to really cement these questions in your brain as we move forward, and hoping that you can keep these questions this question in the back of your brain as our presentations proceed. So let's talk a little bit about context of Canadian library publishing. Some of this information about library publishing comes from fellow library publishers in Canada, some of whom are on this call. And some of this information is also being compiled as a result of Carl has another community engagement team for library publishers. In a nutshell, library publishing starts in roughly the late 90s. It's fairly widespread now, with about 35 university libraries having some degree of publishing program. That number may have increased since 2021. We're seeing about 800 library-supported journals in Canada. And I think it's important to recognize that this does reflect a pretty heterogeneous mix. So about half of them are faculty-led and peer-reviewed, but they do also include student journals, some of which are peer-reviewed, some not. Also does include non-peer-reviewed publications, again, still mostly of scholarly interest, but also includes a fair number of inactive or ceased journals. And here at York, the inactive and ceased journals are a large core of our collection. Journals that may have begun life and died in print, and then the editors had come to us with their collections and asked us to give them a digital life for the first time after they had ceased publications. Other ones have ceased since moving to electronic distribution, and others have begun life in print and then moved to the electronic ecosystem. Most of our journals are open access. There are a handful of toll access journals. We at York have 4 of our approximately 60 journals are toll access. Those are legacy journals. We're no longer taking on toll access journals. And it looks like no library publisher in Canada requires APCs to publish in open access. In general, now the sample of disciplinary breakdown is drawn from a sample of about half of that total of 800, but I suspect that this does generalize. We're seeing the majority of them being in humanities and social sciences, but as well, there's a smattering in science and engineering, interdisciplinary topics, health. Now, humanities and social sciences is a huge cluster covering things like law and education as well, that in certain disciplinary classifications might not fall into that area. Anyway, this is your sort of quick overview of what library publishing in Canada looks like. Happy to answer any further questions here. However, beyond this slide, I want to make it clear that I'm not necessarily speaking for other library publishers unless they specifically identify themselves. This is giving a snapshot of the context. And at this point, we're going to switch gears and talk about what's going on at York in the York Digital Journals, or YDJ publishing program. There have been 3 different drivers for statistical reporting and research impact requests. The first, which is relatively straightforward and more or less in hand, is things like departmental reporting. You know, what is the size of the program? How much do we publish? Fairly basic things that don't even necessarily get into research impact or bibliometrics. Fairly uncontroversial. Getting a little bit more complicated, we've got requests coming from authors or journals. One of the biggest drivers for these is support for the triennial Aid to Scholarly Journals, or ASJ grant program, which is a SHRC program every 3 years, gives $30,000 over 3 years to successful applicant journals in Canada. Now, there are also some additional requests that have come from authors and journals that I've seen that have to do, I would say, generally with tenure and promotion types of questions. So journal editors are often asking on behalf of contributing authors, what's the impact factor, or what kind of metric have we got from this journal so that I can highlight this in my tenure promotion application or job applications or other grant applications. To a smaller degree, I'm also getting those questions from the editors themselves, especially if they might be attached with a research unit and the research unit wants to report on their success and their impact. So these are more, I guess, specialized bibliometric type requests. With the ASJ application, as I recall, the last round, there weren't requests for a specific set of metrics, but there was a more general research impact demonstration statement that was invited. But the last one that I want to, that is near and dear to my heart, is the appealing for support for the YDJ program within the institution, both within the library and within the university as a whole. At York, we generally support publishing as an infrastructure issue, and there's less support for the production end, things like copy editing, layout, editorial assistance that the journals often need. And within the Diamond OA model, there's not a lot of support for that. So over the last few years, I've been exploring what are options within the university to try to get additional support for that. And it's been a little bit tricky because we're running into some prejudices about how library publishing is perceived within the institution, and a little bit of a hangover of how open access is perceived. So at its very worst, and I wouldn't say this is a majority opinion by any means, that we do run into the occasional opinion that library publishing is more of a vanity press and that there's no real editorial oversight. I think that's untrue, and I think it's rather unfair and uninformed. So we're really working against that. But there's, an ongoing question of, what's the research impact? Sure, you're publishing journals and you have quite a few, but what are they actually doing? And in one of these conversations with the Office of the VP Research and Innovation, one of the AVPs of Research Innovation was saying, well, we don't really have any money. We can't support this. And besides, we're more interested in supporting impactful journals and impactful research. And my question to her was, that's fantastic. How do you measure impact? What are the metrics that you're looking for? Tell me what they are. I'll try to give them to you. And the response is crickets. There is just no response. So I think that there's something about the rhetoric of numbers that go up that people love to see, and people love to couch their intuitive decisions in the rhetoric of numbers. But I don't really know what those metrics are. So, one of my overarching questions is, if I could demonstrate impact to someone like this AVP research, what would or could I show them to demonstrate that impact? Moving on now. A little bit about I mentioned that we've got a fair number of data sources available to us at York University. We publish on OJS, Open Journal Systems, as do many of the library publishers in Canada. OJS has a certain suite of dashboard stats and reports, as well as other system stats that we can pull out from the API that can be quite useful for determining, basic program sizing type of things. There are also some traffic stats that are potentially useful there, and I'm working on trying to use those hand in hand with our web analytics platform, and we use Matomo for that. There are also some OJS plugins which do display article level metrics from various sources. They're more display oriented and at the article level, and not really something you can scrape. We also do subscribe to a number of bibliometric sources. So Altmetrics Explorer and Dimensions, Scopus, Web of Science, and JCR. Not subscription, but still available, Google Scholar, OpenAlex, and we are Crossref members. So, there's a large number of potential sources for data and information that might inform impact statements. Now, I mentioned a general overarching concern with what ought we focus on as library publishers, but these are, in a little more detail, the kinds of questions that I've been running into, and some of here we're getting into some of what I see as more of the specific challenges of library publishing. So how best to illustrate the impact at the program level? So especially when we're focusing on trying to get support for the publishing program and to support library publishers in general, what are the ideal program level metrics or impact statements that we should be focusing on? But at the same time, there is still some interest in journal level metrics and impact reporting. Beyond that, can we generate consistent, uniform, automated journal level metrics for individual journals? Now, where the challenges are concerned, where that a lot of bibliometrics data sources rely heavily on DOIs, and a lot of our publications have received DOIs fairly late in life. Again, either because we are their electronic archive, or because the journals migrated in the middle of their publication run, either from print or from other electronic sources. And in a lot of cases, we are giving them DOIs for the first time, and they are appearing late in the citation lifecycle of any given article. We do have a fairly large program. We've got 59, it might be now 60 journals with published content for a total of almost 1,600 issues and about just over 27,000 published articles. I say articles, but items, could be reviews, editorial content. Each of these are an individual instance of OJS. So it's a fair bit to try to capture. And at the same time, I'm the program. We do have one contract, Bibliometrics, and an impact librarian who is on leave, although I do believe I saw her name in the participants list. Hi, Lily, if you're there and listening, who's been very helpful in a consulting basis. But we don't really have staff or IT support. So the limited resources available to, work with this information and extract and analyze it is really a barrier. And that does tie into the third of these questions of how do we generate consistent, uniform, automated journal level metrics? Because really that's generally what we have capacity to do alongside all of the other daily business of supporting the journals. I want to give a case study here from one of our journals, Tessera, that published from 1984 to 2005. This published only in print up until 2005. Shortly after it ended, the editors entered discussion with one of my predecessors who started working with them to place their digital archive in YDJ to allow the journal an electronic afterlife. I do believe that the content finally went live in 2011. I've actually got that date as a speaker note that I can't view right now, but the content went live after a certain hiatus of several years after the cessation of publication. And we're seeing from various sources here a pretty wide gap in, or a pretty wide range in the number of citations given. So in Google Scholar, the most cited piece from this journal hits 774 citations. At the same time, Altmetric Explorer, which from my understanding should be interacting with dimensions, is not citing any academic sources and is even only noting that 10 outputs are tracked, which to me is weird considering that they do all have DOIs. Meanwhile, Dimensions is showing that the same highly cited article in Google Scholar is pulling in 91 citations relative to the 774. Now, perhaps for those of you who are better steeped in the details of these different platforms, that may not be surprising. But for somebody who's just dipping my toes into them, I'm thinking, oh man, what on earth is going on here and what to look at? I should also note that a journal like this is not indexed in Scopus, Web of Science, or the JCR, and is probably not very interesting to them because it is ceased. And I would say that this is typical of a certain kind of art journal, less indicative of the currently active and publishing journals. But I would say that a lot of them share this issue of, having very disparate numbers coming up from different sources, but also not being tracked in some of the major sources such as Scopus or Web of Science. So I am interested in delving more into those sources to find out which are the ones we ought to be looking at, or how perhaps to combine them, if that's what we do. Now, as far as taking a snapshot of some of the activities that we've been engaged in here at York, been rolling out the DOIs to the remaining journals that don't yet have them. I think that at this point, pretty much everything does, unless we've got serious metadata issues that are, that we want to resolve before minting the DOIs with Crossref. But in general, for ongoing publications and for ongoing records keeping, we're hoping that having DOIs does help with capturing, citation metrics going forward. And all of our new journals are receiving DOIs, so that's less of a concern for the new journals. This slide is recycled from a previous presentation given to the library publishing community. So looking at the OJS API, perhaps less relevant to you, but that's a topic for discussion within the library publishing community. The main thing that I'm doing right now is taking a step back from actually looking at the metrics to work on the coding skills, to work with the APIs and to wrangle the data. That's very big with the OJS API, but my understanding is a lot of the metric sources are going to be interactable with and harvested with the through the API calls. So I see that as a necessary skill. And again, that brings us to the generalizable, automated, consistent extraction of metrics. And then finally, and something that I've done a little bit of work on and would love to get more in advice from the community here, is figuring out which metrics to prioritize and which kinds of impact statements I ought to prioritize, both for singing the praises of the publishing program as a whole, as well as what might be useful to the individual journals. And without any further ado, coming pretty much on time for once, I have done with my content. So I'm going to stop my share right now and turn it over to Katie. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. Let me just see if I can get my screen sharing here. Okay. Does my screen look good to everybody? Awesome.
Yes,
all right, thanks. Good. Yeah, that's awesome. My name is Katie Cuyler, and I'm an open publishing and government information librarian at the University of Alberta Library. The presentation that I'm going to do is going to follow a pretty similar format and cover pretty much the same things as Tomasz has just spoken about, but from the University of Alberta library publishing perspective. And then we're hoping to have some discussion with people here. So we're going to end with some discussion questions. So, oh, that's the wrong button. There we go. Okay, so to talk a little bit about the journal publishing program that we have at the University of Alberta. We have about 70 actively publishing journals. About 40 of those are scholarly journals. And then we do also have quite a large cohort of student journals that we work with as well, but this conversation is a little less relevant to that. And the rest of the journals are sort of like conference proceedings and some course journals and other miscellaneous things. We are also using Open Journal Systems. OJS is the acronym that we kind of use for that. And all of the journals that we publish are Diamond Open Access. So, no fees charged to authors or readers at any time. We do have a little bit of criteria for journals that publish with us, being that, of course, that they're diamond open access, that they license all of their content under a Creative Commons license, and that they have a Canadian post-secondary affiliation. And I did also want to mention the team that we have, because I do think we have a pretty well-staffed team compared to a lot of publishing programs across the country. And I think particularly the fact that, at least for the few years that I've been working with this portfolio, we've been able to have 2 student publishing assistants has been really, really helpful, and has really allowed us to do the reporting that we have been doing. Honestly, the students do a lot of that legwork, so I do think that's an important thing to note. In terms of needs for impact and metric reporting, I kind of think of them in 2 categories. So there's the needs of the publishing program, and then there's the needs of the individual journals. So for our publishing program, we're reporting to our own stakeholders. We use metrics for planning our programs and assessment. And then, of course, as Tomasz mentioned, there's a lot of raising awareness about our programs and our publications, and the quality of them and the reach of them and the impact in that. But it's tricky, as this whole discussion is kind of showing. All right, for our journals, they tend to want these metrics and reporting for their own management and editorial planning, for funding applications, things like the Aid to Scholarly Journals grant. Had a lot of requests in the past couple of years for indexing applications, and trying to understand if journals are applicable for certain databases and stuff like that. So really understanding their reach and their content. As well as just stakeholder reporting. So, for their own annual reports, if they're trying to request course release, trying to get funding from their departments, their institutions, any of those various things where they want to prove how impactful their journals are. So the most commonly used data sources that we use the data coming from OJS, probably the most, because of course that's where we're publishing in, so we get that use, views, and downloads of content. But you can also get some metrics on editorial workflow that can be useful for some other program planning and stuff like that. We have been looking into using the OJS API as a way to automate some of the reporting, and Google Scholar gets used a fair bit. We used to have Google Analytics before the recent change of Google Analytics, and that was a really useful source, but unfortunately we no longer have that on our OJS instances, and we haven't yet made the decision whether to replace it with something and what to replace it to. So that is something that for our impact reporting, we're really feeling the absence of, because it's harder to show, like readers from this area of the world and that kind of stuff, which is something we had traditionally used to show the reach of some of our journals. We use Crossref as well, and really any database where we can find citation information on the journals. This is a little bit muddy because the journals just aren't consistently indexed in the same place. So it's really just different for every single journal. Okay, so what kind of current reporting do we do regularly? We provide individual reports to journals quarterly. We do some annual program reporting for the publishing program. We do a fair bit of assessment of journals for indexing, and then just like anything, if we get ad hoc requests, we'll try to respond to those as we can. So this is an example of the individual journal reports. All of this data is being pulled directly from OJS, so it's article views and article downloads. It's just a couple pages for their most recent issue, and then for their most accessed articles of all time, just to give them kind of a snapshot. We only do this for select journals, so this is for sort of that group of that 40 scholarly, I guess scholarly peer-reviewed, like not for the student journals or journals that are less active and that kind of thing, basically. And this right now is being manually pulled by our student publishing assistants quarterly and then sent to the journals. This one, we are very lucky to be partnering with our research impact team. Shout out to the research impact team at U of A to automate filling this data with the OJS API. So we're really excited about that and hoping we'll be able to do that in the next few months. So that's the individual journal reporting. We also do know just from general feedback that the journals love receiving these reports, but we are planning in the near future to kind of do some more direct assessment with them so we can learn more about how they're using them, which will hopefully help us in, you know, developing future reporting. The other thing that we do is annual program reporting. And this actually just started last year, and it's kind of for the overall program use. So we publish journals, but we also publish open educational resources. So it would include both of those things. And this is much more of a qualitative impact report, you know, usually collected by the knowledge within the team. But we do also include our most accessed titles. And that's really been just from the OJS usage metrics at this point, but we're always kind of looking for ways to expand this and ways to make it more meaningful if we can. For our own journal programs, something we try to incorporate in here a little bit is the standards that we try to work to for our journals have really been through quality policy support, which is sort of difficult to measure, but we've, you know, trying to follow the CoP best practices and encouraging journals to become CoP members. We do also measure some of our, some of that quality, if that's the right word, based on the numbers of our journals that are participating in like trusted programs like being indexed in Coalition Publica or being indexed in the DOAJ or receiving the DOAJ seal. Those are some of the metrics that for like the program we're really interested in. Okay. I also mentioned that we do get a fair bit of requests for indexing assessment, and this is really where we just go wherever we can find data. We use a lot of OJS, wherever they're indexed, and then a lot of Google Scholar and that type of thing. These visuals on here are actually not created by our team. I just liked to showcase them because one of our journals, the journals that publishes with us, Critical Gambling Studies, they had a really big project where they wanted to get their journal indexed in Scopus and in Web of Science. And so they actually hired a research assistant to spend, you know, like, I think it was 6 months to do a really in-depth analysis to figure out what the reach of the journals, where the authors are publishing from, analyzing the citations. And they really did a ton of work. If you want to see more about that, there is a webinar linked in the slides, which we'll share later. But I just wanted to mention this to show that this is something our journals are really interested in, and they're investing a lot of time, and they have limited funding, and then they're putting funding into it. So it continues to come up. Okay. So some of the challenges that we're having, and some of these will be repeated for things that Tomasz has already said, we have some common challenges. Our journals are indexed in a variety of databases. So we don't really have any consistent indexing other than indexing where we can find citations, right? Other than Google Scholar, and then of course OJS, but it doesn't have citations. So comprehensive program analysis has been really limited with the sort of bibliometrics, I guess. We are really excited about the potential of OpenAlex for working in this more comprehensive analysis area. But that's just like early days And a lot of our journals have a community focus where they really want to engage with maybe more local communities, smaller communities. And so they're measuring their impact in a really qualitative way. And that's just kind of harder to represent. There's also been, we've had questions about the appropriateness of certain metrics or indexing in certain databases. We have some journals that on principle have not wanted to be indexed in Scopus or Web of Science and have, we had one even last year that declined to be indexed, and they actually like quite forcefully pushed back that they in their license had a non-commercial license and that they would not allow any of their content to be crawled or ingested. So sometimes that makes it hard too, right? Because then it's just comparing apples to oranges is more difficult. A lot of our journals, one of the most common questions that we get is that they are really seeking more support from the institutions that they work with, from their research offices, and more recognition of that these journals are scholarly and the quality and impact of them. But it seems to come up a lot that it is a bit of a battle. So we do always get the request. And this one, it's a little bit of an aside, but for myself personally, I do always wonder about showing the impact of student journals and capturing that sort of learning experience, which might be a whole other talk, but that is one that I think about a lot. So what we wanted to do was at this point kind of throw back to people here some questions and hopefully have some discussion. So a couple questions to maybe think about or get people started. We would love to hear what kind of impact reporting people do for individual journals, the kind of metrics they use. Maybe, I don't know, is there a process? Is there a template? What do you find works the best? That kind of thing. Yeah, and there's some other questions here that we can look at. So, you know, what metrics do you think we should prioritize? Is there any sources of metrics that we haven't talked about that are really obvious? We would love to hear those. Yeah, and then just this is, I guess, maybe more philosophical, theoretical, but there's that struggle between the qualitative and the quantitative, and, you know, how much can automation help us with this? And yeah, so that's the end of my talking bit, but I would love to, yeah, hopefully have some discussion. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen so I can see the chat and people again, but